Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, news on COVID and how, despite it not being quite the media item it previously was, it's still circulating and still causing inconvenience. A natural alternative to Ozempic, although you should take what we say with a lot of salt. A common condition may double your risk of erectile dysfunction and therefore a lack of fun. Maths has suggested a third type of particle, although again, lots and lots of salt. The Paris-Berlin supertrain. China to plant a flapping flag on the moon as a lunar first, and of course other news items. You can find these news items and others in the description box below. We'll start with COVID-19 because everybody just loves that as a news item. After all, who can't remember the fun years of being stuck inside and staring at walls with paint drying? Was that just us? Fair enough. Well, for a lot of people, it's not exactly something that's gone away, especially if you work in a health setting. You will, if you've experienced any time in, say, a hospital or clinic setting, the on and off mask requirements. A lot of facilities have essentially decided, okay, we don't need it right now, so we're going to cut costs. And then suddenly they have a problem and they've gone, oh crap, quickly, what's the easiest fix? Masks. Rather than try and deal with the underlying cause, which is people are stupid and don't do sensible things when they're sick. But this has essentially led us to the same situation of masks on, masks off, masks on, masks off, and this will likely keep going for nearly forever. The challenge here is that COVID-19 is not going to go away, certainly not anytime soon. Well, it may go away, but the chances of it going away in a way that's good news are minuscule. It going away in terms that are very bad for us, somewhat higher. The real strain at the moment, especially for, say, the Northern Hemisphere, is that it's currently, well, essentially cold and flu season, but a cold and flu now includes COVID, so it's a cold, flu, and COVID season. And if we're really unlucky, a bird flu season. Nature just keeps on giving us these gifts, and they haven't quite understood that we don't want them. Anyway, because of the fact that it's respiratory disease season, there is a lot of concern, especially in clinical and hospital settings, that, well, people are going to spread diseases. They're going to keep on giving those gifts, and it's one of the big reasons why the hospitals and similar settings are bringing in mask requirements once more. Basically, places like the CDC have said, this is not going to go away, and there's a good chance you're going to be hit hard, so we strongly suggest you wear a mask. And a lot of hospitals are looking and gone, yeah, we don't want to have the nurses, doctors, and similar out of action because, at least in America, we'll lose money, so yeah, let's put them into effect again. The other exciting news we have is that there is a newer strain that appears to have become dominant. It appears to be at least something of a cross between two prior strains, primarily the Omicron variant and another, and that's why it's become dominant. Good news, however, and we say good news with a lot of cynicism, it's nowhere near as severe an infection as something like Omicron would have been. As such, you may feel slightly ill, but you're not likely to die from it and not likely to have severe symptoms. However, as mentioned, more time viruses spend in a human host, or any host for that matter, the more likely they are to mutate, the more likely there is to be a new variant of concern. And next we have a related news item, although it's actually an old article, but it addresses a circulating issue at the moment. It's a photograph showing two boys, and very obviously so, one of them is ill. It's a comparison of the individual on the left being unvaccinated for smallpox or chickenpox, and the one on the right being exposed to, well, the vaccine, and then subsequently smallpox. You can see a very obvious difference. Now, depending on who you ask, you'll get a variety of responses, some ranging from the, well, this is obvious what happens when you vaccinate someone, to others saying, no, that's a fake photo, and in short, no, it's not. What's key here is that, yes, it has been used in documentaries, but the key thing with it is that the photo was used in those documentaries after it was taken by a doctor in practice in the early 19th century. The idea was, in short, to show the benefits of being vaccinated in the early 1900s by Dr. Alan Warner. The doctor was working in an isolation hospital in Worcester, UK, and they were trying to explain, here's what happens in a medical article when you have a vaccinated individual and a non-vaccinated individual. It's essentially a simple side-by-side comparison. And yes, as said, later on, the images were used in documentaries, but that does not remove the underlying reason and origin of the photo. All it really does is demonstrate that, yes, the image has had impact for a very long time, arguably at this point over 100 years. Shifting to more possibly useful medical news, we have a natural alternative to Ozempic, and although it may not be obvious in audio, we are very heavily quoting the words natural alternative here. The idea is to use a natural way to regulate your blood sugar levels, and it works in a similar manner to Ozempic, although it's not the same thing, to be very clear about it. The idea is that certain bacteria within your GI tract, if they are exposed to various things in your diet, could have made a similar glucagon-like peptide that has a similar function as, well, a glucagon, obviously. As such, it would, in theory, have the same effect as what insulin has. After all, we make insulin nowadays primarily using bacteria, and essentially assembling the three distinct parts of the insulin-like peptide. This is where the research looking at Bacteroides vulgaris in the GI tract and the various metabolites it makes the claim of a natural alternative, and strictly speaking, yes, it would be natural, but then again, natural has no real meaning in most of these terminology, simply because natural is often defined as being of nature, which is like saying natural is natural. It doesn't really help when you often go in circular reasoning. The other key thing here is that the research is primarily based in mice, which, as you can imagine, rodent-based research doesn't always translate to humans, as humans are notably different to rodents. It doesn't mean the research isn't promising, just that you should not take it as a be-all and end-all of possible studies. It needs a lot more work before it can get anywhere near being substantiated. In somewhat more useful news related to medication, although just as, let's say, limited in its application at the moment, a commonly available medication could reduce dementia risk, and unfortunately that doesn't help us at all really. Mostly because anytime you see a headline that says, common medication does X, Y, or Z, you should basically assume that it doesn't. And not because it isn't going to do that, but first of all because there's probably very preliminary data to support its usage in that respect, but more importantly, if it does show that effect, and that's a big if, there's likely to be a patent on it, and therefore its application in that particular role could be limited because, well, that's how patents work. And obviously, you might argue, well, if it's a common drug and it already is out there and got approval, what right do they have to get a patent on it? And it's an application patent rather than a essentially discovery patent. The difference is, discovery patents are, I've made this amazing thing, no one else has thought of it, it's my thing, therefore I have a right to get money for it. Application patents are, there's this amazing thing, but we found a new way to use it that has beneficial results. The second criteria is less often used because it's a weaker protection, but it is used in some cases and quite often in pharmacological studies like this. This is where things get rather more complicated again. So not only do we have to have limited hope for it ever actually going anywhere, but the research itself only found association. And unfortunately, association doesn't really mean much. It is the practical application of correlation does not equal association. Or in other words, hey look, we found this thing, it might be doing this, but the people who are on it might not actually be in that risk group anyway. So life is complicated, as is nearly all research, but this research in particular, yeah. The other problem is that one of the major drugs they looked at and thought this might actually be really helpful is something like ibuprofen. Now, using ibuprofen on a occasional basis is not a bad thing. There are some supposed risks with it, but as long as you're not consuming it daily or on a large amount, you should be okay. However, if you take it on a regular basis and on a larger dose, now you have to start worrying, as it is associated with not just complications to do with your liver, your kidneys, various cancers. There are all sorts of problems with large, long-term doses of ibuprofen. And so this research, although theoretically promising and interesting, yeah, it may not actually help all that much. And it does bring us to the next news item, which sort of works in the opposite direction. That is, rather than being a benefit, this common medication might be to your detriment. That's probably the best word to use. It increases your risk of erectile dysfunction, depending on how sexually active you are or how interested in becoming sexually active you are. This could be a big thing. It's also that, well, irritable bowel syndrome. This is probably going to already have a fairly significant effect on your sex life. So the fact that even if you can have sex, you physically can't is going to be a problem. There is, however, a big but to this. And that big but is that it's based on a small study of 133 students. Yeah, we're not talking a large sweeping study here. The other issue is that it essentially recruited only medical school students. Students who are already experiencing fairly high levels of stress and discomfort for a range of reasons. And as such, they're likely to be experiencing psychological problems. And there's a fairly close association between things like irritable bowel syndrome, erectile dysfunction, and psychological stress. So we can't take this study at its face value, so to say, but it might possibly be indicating something useful. But it requires more research, to use the catch cry of all researchers. Next we have news that is somewhat more significant in terms of politics and health. RFK Jr. kinda screwed up. He's making a lot of money out of his anti-vax movement. And you might claim, oh, he's not an anti-vaxxer. No, he is. He might sell himself now as a vaccine skeptic or similar, but he's been clear in the past about his stance on vaccines. He's also worked actively to stop vaccines being used in various places like Samoa, and most recently, he didn't admit that he was receiving $1.2 million over a period of time when asked about getting money for his anti-vaccine work. Understand, that's not the kind of money where you might say, for example, drop it down behind the couch cushion and forget it's there, pick it up on the sidewalk, or lend it to someone and forget you gave them, say, that $20. No, this is millions of dollars, and it was a requirement when he was being nominated for his role in government. He claimed instead that it was unpaid and the opposite of a profit motive. $1.2 million seems a lot like a profit motive. Still, this brings us to the original issue, and it does very much play into a circle of issues that he has. It's his work with the Children's Health Defense, the same organization that tried to ramp up anti-vaxxer sentiment in Samoa, claiming that when two nurses inadvertently killed children with purported vaccines that turned out to not be vaccines, that he wasn't paid for his work there at that time. Understand, RFK Jr. was in charge of Children's Health Defense at the time, was president in Samoa around that time, and knew what the hell was going on. And he's claiming that he had no profit interest in it. $1.2 million, remember? For somebody who claims that he does what he does as a labor of love that costs him friends and money, he's making a lot of money. Understand, this is not a short period for which he's getting paid. It's a fairly long time frame. And as such, we can argue that not only is he being dishonest, since he got nominated, clearly somebody's picked up that he's being dishonest, and then he's amended his forms quietly and in the background without making it clear that he's actually changed his position, and that he's actually made a small fortune out of his work. Understand, between 2017 and 2023, the non-profit that he was trying to run, that being the Children's Health Defense, for all intents and purposes paid Kennedy up to $2.2 million. It's a period of about 6 years, meaning that for every year he worked for them, along with his various speaking fees and everything else he does, he was earning somewhere around $300,000 to $400,000 a year. That's just from his Children's Health Defense work, let alone his other various fees and expenses, which come into nearly $10 million over that same time frame. And next we have maths news that's likely to annoy physicists. Mathematicians have claimed that there is a third and arguably impossible form of existence. Most physicists have essentially claimed that there are just two, fermions and bosons. The bosons being those really tiny particles that they were trying to discover with CERN, and have since done so, or at least claimed to have. Understand, they're very tiny. The Chinese research argues that although fermions and bosons could exist in physical reality, the third type could also exist. Generally, it's understood that fermions are what make up matter in form of particles, and bosons that are those that make up forces. It's somewhat more complicated, but let's keep it simple with that for now. These new particles are supposed to be called anyons, and they fit into a space where neither boson particles nor fermions really explain what's going on. Understand, this is a relatively new and arguably somewhat contentious area of research, mostly owing to the fact that, well, it's relying very much on a lot of inferential understanding. In news that's more inferential, there's supposed reports that Meta and, by extension, Facebook is undergoing a degree of chaos, mostly because internal staff are very angry at Zuckerberg. And not because he's a lizard man and they're trying to prevent his takeover of the world, although that's possible too. Instead, they're angry because of the changes that Meta has made to various user agreements and rules, mostly having to do with various progressive agendas. We say agenda just to make this simple. Most people understand that progressive will be things like trans rights, abortion rights, things like the alphabet soup as to however long that's now, various issues with migration, and so on and so forth. And because the new rule change has allowed people to be more free in what they're saying on Meta, that the employees at Meta are very unhappy. And they're arguing that it's essentially allowing people to freely speak badly of others and similarly disparage them. Essentially, people aren't being politically correct. And unfortunately, Meta employees, to a certain extent, want users of Meta and its various products to be politically correct. In some news that will bring people together, ideally in a controlled manner, the Paris and Berlin high-speed train launches its service with fares just under €60, which, considering the price, distance and speed of travel, it's actually quite good. The current expected travel time at its best opportunity is somewhere around 10 to 11 hours. The new high-speed network will allow it to take under 8 hours in ideal conditions. It will allow for the Germans in Berlin to literally blitzkrieg Paris. News that isn't so new, but news that's probably going to keep causing problems for years, is a look at zombie facts. Zombie facts are basically various claims that have become so entrenched into society, mostly due to initial high media coverage and then a lack of critical coverage after the fact, that people just repeat them forever and ever afterwards. A simple example would be drinking 8 glasses of water a day. That's not what the research was looking into. The research concluded that you consume 8 glasses of water a day, and the vast majority of which is in food that you consume that way, and not in drinking it. A more recent example would be the examination of black plastic that we touched on a few weeks ago, a study in which the authors managed to miss a zero and therefore overstate their findings by 10 times. Yeah, they literally tried to claim that you are sitting on nearly all of your daily allowable intake just from exposure, and yet once you actually get to the proper number, it drops down to maybe 8% if you're lucky. Yeah, this is why these zombie facts are a big issue, and especially some studies that make massive claims but don't really follow up on them very well. And there are certain media companies that are more guilty of this than others. The problem is very simple. Corrections are not sexy. They will not sell and they will not get the public's interest. But if you tell the public, for example, that you can solve their erectile dysfunction by taking just 1 tablet a day and they will have sex all day long with the most attractive women or men in the world, well, that's going to get attention. But if a week later you publish an article saying fraudulent research was used to substantiate claims of erectile dysfunction cure, that won't get interest. It's one of the major reasons why, for example, Wakefield's ridiculous MMR causes autism research was such bullshit and had such a big impact. It took forever for it to be retracted. Admittedly, the guy then lost his medical license because of his bullshit practices, but then it also led to further problems around the fact that while it was published, it was then retracted because a big pharma or some other bullshit, QAnon conspiracy bullshit, and therefore it now still circulates. So in some respects, it's almost better when people agree to their mistakes honestly and make fast corrections. But that's not what really happens. And it's why media should be more critical and should arguably be required to give as much coverage in the form of volume and frequency of articles for something that they've initially published on bad information as they do when good information comes out. In astrological news, we have China's plan to plant a flag on the moon, which isn't all that exciting. Many countries now have put flags on the moon. It's just a thing that happens. Humans find a place and they decide this place needs a flag to look homey. It's possibly a byproduct of colonialism, where the British would get somewhere, find a nice bit of open beach, put their flag there and go, this is now British land. Oh, there are locals? That's okay, they're now British citizens, it doesn't matter. China's plans are a little bit different though. Just about all the flags you see in space at the moment do not do one important thing. They don't move. And so China's plan, special plan at that, is to make their flag unique by having it flap. Why is a mystery, but sure. It will also now raise some serious questions for flat earthers and various other conspiracy theorists to deny the moon landing as to how it is that the flags don't move, because at least one will be now. The mechanism by which it will move, however, is a little bit more interesting. In order to make it happen, it's going to have some closed-loop wires, which via magnetic currents will cause it to create a waving motion. The whole idea was inspired by a student suggesting, why not have a flapping flag on the moon, which perhaps should have been shot down with a, because that's not how the moon works. But so be it. Hopefully at least there'll be a student interested in becoming a rocket scientist now that they managed to achieve one sort of a quasi-experiment. The final news item we have for you takes us further out into space and all the way to Mars, and it's evidence of open water. Now, this isn't that new or surprising. Essentially, we've had a fairly solid idea that at some point there was open water on Mars. Admittedly, no time in recent history, but going back billions of years, yes. Whether this is evidence based on the various geological features, various observations about the sedimentary layers and so on. All these things and more indicate quite clearly that yes, there was free-moving water, at least to some extent. This brings us to the most recent source of evidence, and that is the findings from Curiosity. Curiosity arrived in 2011, and it's basically been wandering its happy little ass all over the planet since. It's like if you send a toddler into somewhere new and exciting, they will wander around and want to touch all the things. And that's what Curiosity has done. It's gone out there with an array of instruments and drills, cameras, and various analytic devices to get ideas about the soil, the atmosphere, and more. And so the most recent publication derived from these analyses shows what appear to be ripples on the Martian surface. Now, the ripples themselves don't seem to be much at first glance, but if you think about how they're generated, it's obvious that they're from dried up bodies of water. That is, in order for the ripples to be generated, you need something moving in a wave-like motion. Now, sure, something other than a liquid could have done this, but the probability seems to be awfully low. Option 2 is that the aliens are just screwing with us and deliberately setting up pitfalls and traps for us to find and go, wow, look at this amazing thing, and they're laughing their happy little asses off in spaceships, watching Curiosity find their silly pranks. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.